So I wonder where you personally stand on the question of Christianity and politics. Should the church be political? And if so, then how? There was a time in this country when the church was more or less expected to act as the right arm of the government by backing up its decisions and authority. And the Church of England was seen as having a particular role in this. And when the Tory party, the forerunner to the modern Conservative Party, first emerged, the role of the church was a big part of what it wanted to protect, because it saw the church as so vital to conserving what was seen as important for this country. Now, plenty of others have then reacted against this. So the French Revolution in 1789 was all about throwing off oppression, which included as much as anything the role of the church. And it's really from that point that the separation, or the idea of the separation of church and politics, really started to gain traction, especially on the left of politics. And there's a direct line between that event, which shaped so much political thinking, down to the 1990s, when New Labour's Alastair Campbell famously declared these words. He said, "We don't do God." And others on the left of politics have been even more extreme than that. So Karl Marx, the founder of communism, he famously described religion, and he was thinking particularly about Christianity, as the opium of the people. And what he meant by that was that Christianity was a drug, and a dangerous drug, used by the ruling class to control the working classes by offering them false comfort in place of genuine social change. Now, there are, of course, lots of positions between those two extremes. And Christians exist on both the right and the left of politics, taking quite often a more nuanced, a more balanced perspective on this issue. But a book on Christianity and politics in America caught my eye some time ago because of its subtitle. This is the book. It's a book by the Christian writer Jim Wallis, and it was called God's Politics, and the subtitle was this, to make it a bit clearer. There it is on the right-hand side. Why the American right gets it wrong and the left doesn't get it. Quite an interesting title. Why the American right, it's talking about politics, gets it wrong and the left doesn't get it. Now that's a statement that I believe has just as much insight about Britain. The political right in Britain at the moment is really trying quite hard to rediscover Christianity. It's attempting to do this with some enthusiasm in its attempt to recover what it sees as important for preserving, or perhaps more accurately recovering, the values this country needs, while the political left in general terms still regards Christianity with quite a lot of suspicion. Now, many of you will know that I've appeared on GB News quite a lot recently, and that in itself reflects the current desire on the political right to rediscover Christianity. And my Easter Day afternoon was quite interesting, as I engaged with two right-wing political commentators and a left-wing political commentator on the place of Christianity in this country and the issue of whether Christianity is currently under attack. Let's have a watch.
Yes, we can finish
Absolutely.
Final question. There is this narrative, and I've covered it before on this channel, especially over Christmas, when you see signs such as winter, wonderlight, you know, holiday magic without the word of Jesus or Christmas anywhere. Is this narrative, is this feeling that Christianity is somehow under attack in the UK? Do you give any weight to that?
I want to be careful on this because for a long time Christianity had a privileged position in this country where and Christianity, the Christian church, was guilty of dishing out a lot of persecution and not behaving terribly well. So I think there's been quite a strong reaction against that, which we're still in. So I don't want to bleat too much. You know, if people give the church a good kicking, then we should be able to cope with that. And, you know, if we have to win the right for people to listen to our message, that's no bad thing. I don't want to go back to the days when there's uncritical deference, when people tug their forelock to the vicar. You know, I want people to listen to the message that we're saying and evaluate whether they think that's serious or not. So certainly in this country, I don't think Christians are given too tough a time. There are other parts of the world where they really are being persecuted, and they need our support big time.
I mean, the latest example was Syria. Jelani's men, should we call them, horrible videos dragging people through the streets, executing them. So,
but with the King's speech, for instance, when he, it was mainly about Easter, he referenced Islam.
Why did he do that?
Well, I think he wanted to show his respect for those who are Muslims. It was a very small part of it. It wasn't as though the whole thing was hijacked by just becoming about Islam.
But it's a Christian moment. I don't understand why he did. Would you do a Ramadan speech?
No, but you see, the history of our country, because it's been so dominated by Christianity, I think that at points like that, people like the King are thinking, well, I don't want to give the impression that I'm not respecting Muslims. But Christians can cope with that. I wasn't offended by that. Do you know what I mean? It wasn't an anti-Christian statement.
I think Christians were offended by it.
Some were, but I think that we...
non-Christians.
Yeah, but I think we can be a bit more robust than that.
And I also don't think Muslims would have been offended by hearing an Easter speech from the King, who's
no, they wouldn't
the church,
no.
which didn't...
You're absolutely right.
Asking for it, but it was. We live in a Christian country. Good Friday and Easter Monday are national holidays in a way that sort of Jewish, Sikh, Muslim festivals are not. It's literally the state religion. It's appropriate for the head of the Church of England to reach out to other faiths on Christian festivals.
Why? I don't see why.
Well, it was done in a fairly... It wasn't a deconstruction of Christianity. You know, I want the Christian message proclaimed really strongly. That's what I spend the whole of my life doing. But I want to make sure that in the process, Muslims don't think I despise them, Sikhs don't think that, Hindus don't think... So we can throw out things that say, we're hearing you as well.
Why is it that we can criticise Christianity, but we can't really criticise Islam?
Well, I think that is a fair point, and sometimes I get as frustrated as anyone when that happens. But I think it's the point I was saying earlier. I think because Christianity has dominated in this country for so long, people, perhaps unfairly, perhaps wrongly, think it's fair game in a way that they don't with other religions, you know.
The reason I ask is because I think that is linked as to why the King felt the need to mention Islam.
Why can't he criticise? When can you not criticise other religions out of interest?
What do you mean?
Well, you say.
Well, ask the French school teacher who was decapitated for falsely being accused of drawing the Prophet Muhammad.
Well, that was in France.
School teacher.
Yeah, it was in France.
You're allowed to criticise. You're allowed to criticise all religions in this country.
No, somebody burnt the Quran in central London a few weeks ago, and they were banged up for it. Is that right?
Well, that was an act of. I think that's personally is an act of racial hatred.
Right. Well, there you go.
No, that's not saying that's not
racial hatred.
Burning a book.
It's not racial hatred.
Burning a religious book. I'm not commenting on the penalty for it. I think it was an act of religious hatred. I'm not sure how it should be punished. But I think it's not the same as criticising. Criticising religion is not the same as burning.
Jonathan, you and I both know we're both adults. We're both of a clear mind, I hope. That if the levels of criticism aimed towards Islam is not acceptable as it is towards Christianity. There are more severe consequences.
But part of the reason for that is what we were just talking about. The Christianity is the religion of the establishment, literally the religion of the establishment in this country.
Why is it then that Christian festivals like Christmas and Easter, especially Christmas, it's a bit more obvious then that we go to a Christmas market and they'll call it a winter wonderland. And when you go and speak to the stalls there, I think actually as Ben did, because I watched it, Ben was going around speaking to the market traders, and a few of them were saying we're not allowed to mention the word.
We had that primary school as well.
I don't know if you went to the same Christmas markets I did, but non-Christmas.
We had the primary school in Hampshire a few weeks ago cancelling all Easter celebrations.
Okay. It was a non-denominational school that was under no obligation to have an Easter service.
I think
the head teacher did make a decision to cancel that because she thought it was being inclusive. It was one school.
I think the racial angle comes into it quite a lot, that people can have a go at Christianity without being regarded as racist, because it's not normally a racial attack. Whereas I think people are concerned when Islam is criticised that is a racist attack. Now, it might not be. People might be making perfectly valid critique of Islam, but I think that sort of racial factor comes in. And a lot of people, I think quite rightly, are worried that will escalate and go to a really ugly place. And I think a lot of these debates, I think, are about us really listening to people's critiques and the points they're making, and not sort of writing them off, and trying to see the best. This is a crucial thing perhaps on Easter Day, to say trying to see the best in what people are trying to do. We had a great debate in the green room just a minute ago, Jonathan and Lee and myself, about trans. Well, it was a trans. I'm afraid you'd forbidden it, but we were discussing it out there. But I was saying, actually really listening to what the other person is saying and what they are trying to protect and value is an important thing, and I thought it was a good debate between us. I felt.
We should have another debate about trans right now.
Well, in many ways, I think that clip sums up precisely what I'm talking about. Those on the political right, rather keen on Christianity, rather keen to invoke it, but perhaps getting it rather wrong by assuming that it should be tribal and anti-woke, and those on the left suspicious of Christianity and rather nonplussed by even its support for some of their causes because they don't really get it. They don't really grasp what it's all about. So what is the answer? Should the church be political, and if so, how? The answer to the first question is, I believe, emphatically yes, while the answer to the second is more complex. And that's because authentic Christianity is neither left nor right, but something much deeper. Something much deeper, affirming some perspectives on either side of that divide, while significantly and dramatically challenging others. And the key to grasping this, I believe, lies in resurrection. It lies in the belief that God will one day, through Jesus, raise the dead and at the same time put the world to rights. And the resurrection is a message of hope that builds firmly out of the Old Testament, including that passage that we had read to us earlier by Pamela from Ezekiel chapter 37. And the context of this prophecy is firmly political. Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem, the capital of Israel, had fallen in 586 to the Babylonians, and that was a terrible disaster. It appeared to show that God had totally abandoned his people. And in the wake of this, the prophet Ezekiel is given this astonishing vision of a valley full of dry bones, dry human bones. The sort of scene that would exist quite commonly in the ancient world after a devastating military defeat. But it had an additional sense as well. Bones remaining unburied in that culture represented God's curse upon the people that they belonged to. So it was all signs of God's judgment having fallen upon the nation of Israel. But then it all changes, doesn't it? Ezekiel is told by God to prophesy to the bones, to speak God's word to them, and eventually they come back to life. First, there's a rattling sound as the bones come together before tendons, flesh, and skin appear and cover them. Now, at that point, the bones have been covered with flesh, but they're still lifeless corpses before Ezekiel is again told to prophesy that God's breath or his spirit would enter into those bodies, giving them life. And that's what happens. Ezekiel prophesies, and God's breath or spirit enters into those bodies, and they become a vast army. And Ezekiel is told that these bones represent the whole house of Israel, and then he's given the interpretation that he's to proclaim. And these are the words. This is what the sovereign Lord says. I'm going to open your graves and bring you up from them. I will bring you back to the land of Israel. I'll put my spirit in you and you will live. And I will settle you in your own land. Then you will know that I, the Lord, have spoken, and I have done it, declares the Lord. And what follows in the second half of Ezekiel 37, we didn't have this bit read, is a further application of what this will mean. So Ezekiel speaks of Israel becoming one united people. All of the divisions of the past, principally the division of Israel into two kingdoms, that will be completely undone. They'll live under one king. They'll reject idolatry, and they'll obey God's laws because God will be dwelling amongst them. With all of this providing a witness to the surrounding nations. And it's a really amazing vision. a vision of a dire political situation being transformed, and being transformed by God, and being transformed by his resurrection power. And while it's referring at this point to Israel, it points to what God, as the Bible continues, will show that he's committed to doing for the entire world. So what can we draw from this and the rest of the Bible, including that other passage that we had read about God and politics? 3 brief points, the first of which is this: God and politics entirely go together. Passages like Ezekiel 37 and plenty of others make this totally clear. And actually, the only way we can avoid it is when we basically ignore the Bible and we replace it with principles supposedly drawn from that same Bible, but carefully depoliticized. If we read the Bible honestly, we see God speaking on the really ever-present political issues that exist. We see God speaking about the proper exercise of leadership, a perennial or constant political issue. We see God speaking about what makes for a healthy society, a constant political issue. We see God speaking about the importance of justice. We see God speaking about how laws should operate, constant political issues. More than that, we actually see some of the current political issues, the more specific ones, about how we should relate to outsiders, aliens, as the Bible sometimes describes them. How to balance the rights of different groupings. That's something that we see in the Bible as well, something that we need to wrestle with at this particular time. And we see also the paramount importance of speaking truth about abuse and oppression. Those things are all present. The fact that the political right often invokes God wrongly and the left often excludes him completely doesn't mean that we have to choose between those two false options. The answer is a third way that recognizes with the political right that God is thoroughly invested in politics, but also recognizing that's in a way that couldn't be more different from the justifying or sanctioning of oppression that the political left so rightly fears. And all of that leads us to a second point, which is this: God establishes political authorities, that's absolutely clear, but always, and this is crucial, always with full accountability for their exercise of power. Both of those different bits are equally crucial. Throughout the Bible, we see a very clear emphasis on God instituting political authorities, and on that basis, those same authorities being entirely accountable to God for how they use their power. Now, that was the basis, actually, of our second reading from Romans 13, where Paul constantly talks about those in political authority being God's servants. That's why I've highlighted it there. Sometimes that passage from Romans 13 is read in isolation from the rest of Romans, and people can read it and think it's just telling people to uncritically accept political power and just be acquiescent to it. But that's not what it's saying. Throughout the rest of Romans, Paul talks about Jesus being Lord of the world, by implication saying that doesn't belong to Caesar, that title. Jesus and Jesus alone is Lord of the world, and look how the emperor and other politicians are described as God's servants. They are God's servants. They are accountable to him. The whole point of Israel's kings being anointed, as our monarchs still are today, if you remember back to the coronation, King Charles was anointed behind that screen. The whole point of kings being anointed is to show two things, not just one. To show that they are appointed by God and they are therefore accountable to him. And not just in a vague and abstract sense that bypasses the people that they rule, because, and this is a crucial point, at the same point that God gave Israel kings, he simultaneously raised up from amongst those people prophets, people like Ezekiel, to speak God's word, very often directly to those kings, and to remind them that they're accountable to God, and to warn both those kings and their people of what happens when that power is abused. You see, the judgment depicted at the start of Ezekiel's vision, that valley full of dead human bones, the judgment in that vision only makes sense, and indeed it's only fair, if those human beings and their leaders have been given a delegated authority by God to care for the world. And before the fall of Jerusalem, prophets like Ezekiel and Jeremiah did precisely that. They called Israel's kings to exercise their power properly, and they warned of the terrible consequences that would occur through failing to do this. And in case we think, well, that's just an Old Testament thing, and once the Old Testament finishes, that's no longer, part of God's truth, we see Jesus in the New Testament doing precisely the same. We see Jesus with the city of Jerusalem warning its leaders that they're heading for disaster if they continue in the path that they're taking the nation. So when it comes to God's establishment of authority, it's once again, I suggest, a case of the right very often getting it wrong because they leave out so much of the accountability that God has built into this arrangement, and the political left, usually because of this omission, not getting it. And both have had terrible consequences. So when we look back through history, we see the abuse of Christianity by those in power as something that's caused terrible suffering. That picture is of the massacre of St. Bartholomew in 1572, when loads of Protestants were massacred by Catholics. There's been plenty of massacres the other way as well. So there's no doubt about it that political rulers invoking Christianity has very often sanctioned the most appalling oppression. But the separation of Christianity from political power by those on the political left has arguably led to even greater devastation. So the openly atheistic regimes of the 20th century, up there you've got Nazism and Hitler, you've got communism in Russia under Stalin, communism in China under Mao. Those have led to extraordinary levels of oppression and genocide. And that links to a final point, particularly building upon Ezekiel's vision, which is this. The hope of resurrection shapes a Christian political agenda. Resurrection, you see, is deeply political, and it is deeply subversive, because resurrection places justice at the heart of God's agenda, and therefore the agenda of all those who belong to him. And that is why the right has always been uncomfortable with resurrection. That's why the political right has always been happy for resurrection to be replaced by this, the more escapist hope of going to heaven when we die. Resurrection has very quietly, very subtly been shunted to one side, because resurrection is radical. Resurrection doesn't say that God's going to leave the world in a mess and just take us all off somewhere else. Resurrection says that God is going to put injustice right. God is going to raise the dead, including all those who've been unjustly killed. God is going to put things right. See, it was precisely the dominance of this as the Christian hope and the complete kicking into touch of resurrection that led Karl Marx to say what he did. Karl Marx rejected what he wrongly assumed to be the Christian message, because Karl Marx saw that escapist version of Christian hope as simply supporting the political status quo. So Marx, I believe, was right to reject what he rejected, but wrong to assume that was Christianity. Christianity is not escapism that just keeps people in their place so they can have pie in the sky when they die. Christianity is radically subversive of everything that is wrong with this world. And the hope of resurrection, prefigured in passages like Ezekiel's vision, it corrects both of these political perspectives. The hope of resurrection says to the right, the political right, that God is all about the bringing of justice in the future and in the present, and that any political agenda without this, at the heart of it, is a betrayal of the authority that God has instituted and will receive the harshest judgment. And the hope of resurrection says to the political left that this justice can and will only come through the action of God. Because kick God upstairs, give him a limited role, or abolish him altogether, and whatever the original aims of a political philosophy like communism, it will swiftly lead to the most appalling oppression. And that's because human sinfulness, which will always remain, human sinfulness allied to a lack of accountability to the Creator God, is an utterly dangerous combination. And so, as with everything else about the Christian life, the vision of God's future plan for this world, and specifically resurrection, provides the key for showing how politics does, to contradict Alistair Campbell, need to do God. And without denying their strengths and insights, being clear about resurrection is the way that Christians can avoid those ways that so often the right gets Christianity wrong and the left so often doesn't get it. Let's turn to prayer.